A small, quiet town. A mother trying to rebuild her life, and an 8-year-old boy whose bright future was stolen in a moment of unimaginable horror. On the night of July 8, 2019, a nightmare unfolded behind closed doors. A convicted felon, a history of violence, and a system that failed to protect the most vulnerable. What happened to Markie Mason? And how did a man with a violent past gain access to an innocent child? This is the tragic case of Markie Mason, a story of justice, heartbreak, and the fight to ensure his memory is never forgotten. Welcome back to True Crime Pulse today. We're diving deep into a case that shook an entire community. If you haven't already, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates on cases like this. Now, let's get into it. This is the heartbreaking story of Markie Mason, a young boy whose tragic fate left a community searching for answers and justice. Mark Edward Mason, Jr., lovingly called Markie, was born on November 24, 2010, in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. He was the eldest son of Marum and Mark Mason Sr. Marum's journey to the United States began long before Markie's birth. Originally from Syria, she immigrated to Newcastle in 1999, facing the daunting challenge of adapting to a new country without knowing English. Fluent only in Syrian Arabic and French, daily life was a struggle until she found support from a compassionate French teacher at the Newcastle area school district. Over time, she became fluent in English and pursued a certification in phlebotomy at Beaver County Community College. After completing her studies, Marum worked at ARC Human Services in Beaver County, assisting individuals with developmental challenges. To make ends meet, she also took on waitressing jobs at Olive Garden and a local restaurant. During this time, she met Mark Mason Sr., and the two eventually married, welcoming 2 sons, Markie, followed by his younger brother a year later. Despite their best efforts, the marriage did not last. After their divorce, Marum was granted custody of the boys, but both parents remained dedicated to co-parenting equally. They worked together to provide Markie and his brother a stable and loving environment. Markie's childhood in Newcastle was filled with the joys of sibling bonds, laughter, and playful adventures. He and his younger brother were inseparable, calling each other best friends. He loved riding his bike through the neighborhood, playing tag and watching cartoons. His passion for Legos kept him busy for hours, constructing elaborate designs, while his love for adventure extended to fishing trips with his father and exploring local parks. Weekends were special, spent baking cookies and cooking meals with his mother. Like many kids his age, Markie adored superheroes, especially Spider-Man, often imagining himself as a hero saving the day. This admiration for justice inspired his dream of becoming a SWAT team officer, a goal he eagerly shared with anyone who would listen. His intelligence was evident early on. He excelled in math and art, showcasing both analytical and creative talents. At school, he was known for his kindness, always willing to share, comfort a lonely classmate, or ensure everyone felt included in playground games. Teachers praised him for his leadership and compassionate nature. But as Markie thrived at school, changes at home disrupted the warmth he had always known. The shift began when Marum entered a relationship with Keith Burley, a 43-year-old man serving time in prison. Their connection started through writeaprisoner.com, a platform where inmates create profiles and communicate with people on the outside. While some seek support and companionship, others develop deep, even romantic relationships, just as Marum and Keith did. Keith's past was deeply troubling. In 1999, at just 23 years old, he was convicted of third-degree murder and burglary after executing a Newcastle man with a gunshot to the back of the head. Sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison, many considered his punishment shockingly lenient given the brutality of his crime. While behind bars, Keith's violent tendencies didn't fade. He racked up additional charges for assaulting fellow inmates. It was during this time that Marum discovered his profile on an inmate pen pal website. Whether out of curiosity or a longing for connection, she reached out. What began as an exchange of letters quickly evolved into something far more serious. Their bond deepened over several months, despite raising concern among those who knew her. Then, against all odds, Keith was granted parole after serving just the minimum 20 years of his sentence. In March 2019, he walked free. With his newfound liberty, his relationship with Marum transitioned from written words to reality. She soon introduced him to her 2 young sons, much to the dismay of their biological father, who vehemently opposed Keith's presence in their lives. But despite his objections, Keith wasted no time embedding himself into the family. At first, things seemed normal. He played the role of a reformed man, and the boys, trusting and innocent, welcomed him with open arms, even calling him by his nickname, Bud. But beneath the facade, Keith remained the same volatile, manipulative man he had always been. Those who knew him described him as unpredictable, his temper a ticking time bomb. His relationship with Marum soon reflected this side of him. Arguments grew frequent, and physical altercations became a dark reality. The once warm and loving home Marum had built for her children turned into a place of fear. Then came the night of July 8th, 2019, a night that would change everything. That evening, Marum picked Keith up from a relative's house while her sons dozed in the back seat. He was supposed to stay the night, as he often did. But tension had been building for weeks, and that night, it finally erupted. Needing gas, Marum pulled into a station and asked Keith to pump for her. His reaction was instant and furious. He snapped, refusing outright, barking at her to do it herself. The argument escalated quickly. Fed up, Marum made a decision. She was taking him back to where she had picked him up. That was the moment Keith lost control. Enraged, he attacked Marum, his left hand clamping around her throat as his right fist struck her face. The force of his blow, amplified by the ring on his finger, split the skin around her left eye, leaving a deep, bloody cut on her face. The boys jolted awake to the sound of their mother's strangled cries. Blinking through their terror, they saw Keith's fingers tightening around Marum's throat as she gasped for air. Panic surged through them, and they pleaded with him to stop. But instead of relenting, Keith escalated his attack, leaning in and sinking his teeth into Marum's cheek with brutal force. Blood dripped down her face, but through the searing pain, she forced the car into drive. Her only thought was escape. With desperation fueling her, Marum sped toward the Newcastle Fire Department, slamming her hand against the horn, hoping, praying, that someone inside would hear. Her sons clung to each other in the back seat, sobbing as Keith's fury reached its breaking point. Before help could arrive, he threw open the car door, stormed around to the driver's side, and ripped Marum from the seat. With terrifying ease, he slammed her onto the pavement. Then, standing over her crumpled body, he uttered 4 chilling words that would haunt her forever. "I am kidnapping the kids." Keith climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and sped off, leaving Marum broken on the ground, screaming in anguish as she watched her sons, their faces pressed against the window, disappear into the night. He drove them to a house in Union Township, a place they had never seen before. Dragging them inside, his rage erupted again. He hurled objects across the room, his screams shaking the walls. Then, in a horrifying display of strength, he seized both boys by the throat, one in each hand, squeezing until their cries turned to choked gasps. When he finally let go, they crumpled to the floor, sobbing and shaking. But the nightmare was only beginning. Keith left the room, returning moments later with something far worse, a gun. He raised it, leveling the barrel at one of the boys' heads. His finger hovered over the trigger. Then, realization. The magazine was missing. Angry, he stormed out again, barking orders at 2 teenage boys who were in the house, demanding they help him find it. While Keith searched, Markie and his brother were left in a bedroom with the older boys who, disturbingly, continued playing video games as if nothing had happened. Moments later, Keith returned. This time, the gun was gone. But in his hand, something else gleamed in the dim light. A knife. And before Markie could even react, Keith attacked him with the knife. The attack was swift and merciless. Consumed by blind rage, Keith plunged the blade into the small, defenseless body of 8-year-old Markie over and over again. His younger brother screamed, pleading for him to stop, but his cries went unanswered. Desperate to save his brother, the 7-year-old ran to the kitchen, grabbed a chair, and tried to fight back, but he was no match for a grown man lost to violence. Keith didn't stop until he had stabbed Markie 146 times, each brutal strike punctuated by a chilling, repeated whisper, "You must die. You must die." Realizing he was next, Markie's younger brother made a split-second decision. He ran. Barefoot and trembling, he sprinted out of the house, down the darkened street, and toward a nearby fast food restaurant. As he reached the drive-thru, he frantically waved his arms, desperate for someone, anyone, to help. Customers rushed from their cars, surrounding the terrified boy as he sobbed out the unimaginable truth. His brother was dead, and the killer was still inside. Within moments, someone dialed 911. When officers arrived at the house, the scene inside was beyond anything they had encountered. Markie's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood, the walls and floor splattered with the evidence of his suffering. Even the most seasoned investigators were shaken by the sheer brutality. But Keith was gone. The moment he realized Markie's brother had escaped, he had fled into the night. A massive multi-state manhunt was launched. Tips flooded in as law enforcement agencies worked relentlessly to track him down. 9 hours after the murder, authorities finally caught up with him in Youngstown, Ohio, just 19 miles away. Spotted walking along Market Street, Keith was quickly surrounded by U.S. Marshals. With nowhere left to run, he surrendered without resistance. Extradited back to Pennsylvania, Keith faced a slew of charges, including assault, terrorism, kidnapping, and criminal homicide. In a bizarre twist, he chose to represent himself in court, his erratic behavior turning the proceedings into a spectacle. At one point, he demanded the jury be replaced, claiming racial bias. The judge swiftly denied his request. After nearly 4 years of delays, Keith's murder trial finally began in August 2023. During opening statements, he attempted to argue that authorities had planted evidence against him. But the prosecution shut down his claims with irrefutable video proof, footage showing Keith wearing the exact clothing he had on when he was arrested. Keith veered off on another bizarre tangent, complaining that his repeated transfers between jails and state prisons had forced him to endure prolonged artificial lighting, which he claimed had damaged his eyesight. How this had any relevance to the brutal murder of an 8-year-old was lost on everyone in the courtroom. The prosecution, in stark contrast, presented a meticulously constructed case, outlining Keith's violent history, his pattern of aggression, and the deep-seated rage that ultimately led to Markie Mason's senseless murder. Prosecutors argued that Keith's fury toward Marum had reached a breaking point, and in a twisted act of vengeance, he chose to hurt her in the most devastating way possible, by taking her child's life. To drive this point home, several of Markie's family members took the stand, including the only person who had witnessed the horror firsthand, his younger brother. Now 11 years old, the boy sat before the court, his small frame dwarfed by the weight of the moment. When the prosecutor gently asked, "Can you tell us what happened to Markie?" his response was heartbreakingly simple. "He got killed. He jumped on Markie and he was stabbing him. I watched and I hit him with a chair." His words hung heavy in the air, leaving the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Markie's father was next. Choked with grief, he struggled to describe the emptiness that had consumed him since his son's death. At one point, overcome with rage, he hurled profanities at Keith, forcing deputies to intervene before the situation escalated further. Finally, it was Marum's turn. Reliving the events of July 8, 2019 was almost unbearable, but she gathered the strength to tell her son's story. As she testified, she locked eyes with the man who had stolen her child's life. Even as Keith, absurdly choosing to represent himself, cross-examined her, the same man she had once called a partner, the same man who had destroyed her family, she remained composed. Then came one final chilling exchange. Keith, in yet another bizarre attempt at control, asked, "When did our relationship officially end?" Without hesitation, Marum delivered a response that silenced the courtroom. "When you killed my son." Throughout the grueling trial, Keith never showed an ounce of remorse. He sat motionless, indifferent, as the horrific details of his crime were laid bare before the jury. It took them only 15 minutes to reach a verdict. In August 2023, the former felon, now a convicted child killer, was found guilty of first-degree and second-degree murder. At 47 years old, he was sentenced to 2 life terms, served concurrently with no chance of parole. Markie's tragic death sent shockwaves through Newcastle and beyond. The senseless murder of an innocent 8-year-old at the hands of a man who should never have been free left many questioning how such a failure could happen. While Marum was undeniably another victim of Keith's violence and manipulation, a haunting question remained. Why had she allowed a convicted murderer into her home, near her children? There were no easy answers. Yet, in the wake of Markie's death, Newcastle came together. Public vigils were held in his honor, with hundreds gathering to remember the bright, loving child taken far too soon. At his school, classmates left flowers, letters, and artwork on his desk, a small tribute to a friend they would never see again. On July 15, 2019, family, friends, and members of the community gathered at St. Elias Orthodox Church to say their final goodbyes. Markie's small white casket lay covered in flowers, surrounded by pictures of his radiant smile, a painful reminder of the joy he once brought. The grief was immeasurable, but so was the love that filled the room. Markie's story is now more than a tragedy. It is a call to action. His memory lives on, not just in the hearts of those who knew him, but in the fight to protect children and prevent violent offenders from slipping through the cracks of the system. His name has become a symbol of awareness, hope, and change. Though his life was stolen far too soon, his legacy endures, ensuring that his story will never be forgotten. Thank you for listening to True Crime Pulse. Share your thoughts on the story, like and subscribe to the channel. Until the next episode, stay vigilant.